So, good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous et bonjour à ceux qui nous suivent en live stream. Nous sommes au pavillon français pour parler du financement des infrastructures durables, de la gouvernance et des solutions de label. So, we're here with a distinguished panel today to discuss financing infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, and label solutions. So this panel is organized in this French pavilion between CDRI, which is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and Fast Infra Group, which we'll talk about both of these things a bit later, which is an initiative initiated by the private sector, but supported by the French Treasury. So this panel will cover the tools and solutions to reinforce infrastructure sustainability and resilience from the CDRI methodology, aiming to help countries review their policies, strategies, and the legal framework, and from the Fast Infra label targeting investors to foster investment in sustainable infrastructure. Just a reminder for those in the room, if there is too much noise because of neighboring panels, you can listen to the same with your headphones, because the microphones are actually directly feeding into these headphones if you don't want to be bothered by the neighbors. So during this discussion, the panelists will share their expertise and perspective on the growing importance of sustainable and resilient infrastructure. They'll explore the potential impact of certification and sustainable infra labels, such as Fast Infra, but there are also BDN that we'll discuss here with one of our panelists in order to catalyze financing, additional financing in financing of the sustainable infrastructure. We are at COP28, but I think the necessity to drive more capital, particularly in emerging markets, has been reminded at every single COP since COP21. And so it's a main topic and trend in the COP, so it's really about addressing this. So really, what this panel will try to do today is to really show the pivotal role that labels can play in catalyzing the transition towards sustainable and resilient infrastructure, and in particular towards emerging market. First, feedback about the self-assessed project having being awarded a provisional Fast Infra label. So we'll talk a little bit about what is going on there in terms of actual implementation. Also, an example of a project that has been tested both with the Fast Infra label, but also the Blue Dot Network label, to also illustrate the mutual recognition and the willingness to actually collaborate in terms of really driving investment into those countries towards sustainable infrastructure. We also have potential users on the panel, as EBRD, represented by Nandita Parshad, multilateral bank, and also HSBC. Christian Deséglises will be from the private sector joining us shortly, but given the size of the expo site, I guess every panel has been missing a few people arriving late nowadays. So bear with us, he'll come with us. But let me begin with a very short keynote presentation on Fast Infra that I have the honor to chair since its creation last year. So to provide the sustainable and exclusive infrastructure services needed to achieve both the SDGs and the Paris Accord climate targets does require a huge effort. So according to the OECD, we should invest around $6 trillion annually and this number sort of doubles every year. And again, we have to remember that every year that we are delayed, the number increases. So we all know that principle by now. So finance is therefore a critical component of the sustainable transition and infrastructure. So Fast Infra is really finance to accelerate the sustainable transition infrastructure. Is a public-private initiative that was conceived by Climate Policy Initiative, CPI, HSBC, the IFC, the OECD, the Global Infrastructure Facility from the World Bank Group under the auspices of the One Planet Summit, and a number of market participants to really provide practical and market-based solution to the mobilization of more finance and to scale finance towards sustainable infrastructure. And I think that's a key point for Fast Infra, was to be market-based. I mean, there are another theme around MDB reforms going on and how MDBs can actually target and scale up financing of such sustainable infra. But the market-based tools is really another way of mobilizing the private sector and private investment into it. So over the last 3 years, Fast Infra has morphed into sort of a public-private multi-stakeholder market-led initiative with over 80 global organizations representing government, financial sector, investors, development finance institutions around the table to focus on the topic and to operationalize the tools designed by the Fast Infra community and deliver concrete results. A non-profit association, Fast Infra Group, was established in Paris in August 2022 with the support of the French Treasury. So the purpose of Fast Infra is to promote such solutions, to develop and improve the investment in sustainable infrastructure. And what really is the role of this group is to sort of incubate multiple solutions to support this goal. The first one that is the most advanced is the label. So the Fast Infra Sustainable Infrastructure label, and Louis here from Global Infrastructure Basel will be discussing the methodology a bit more in detail and discussing the examples around it. The goal is also to disseminate. There are a number of coalitions that already endorse the Fast Infra label, GFANS, ICLEI, the Investor Leadership Network, the LTIA, Long-Term Infrastructure Investor Association, the Sustainable Market Initiative, the Global Infrastructure Basel, that is actually a clear operator on the label, represented here by its CEO, and Bloomberg also collaborating with GIB on this particular topic. So I will not be much longer on introducing what Fast Infra Group means, but clearly I want to give more time to the panelists to discuss and go a bit more in detail and more concrete terms about what this means. So I will start with Amit, who's the Director General of CDRI, for him to give us a bit of a 3-minute pitch on how you contribute to this labeling, policy changing, and to save the world. Let's make it shorter.
Thank you so much, Thierry, and thank you for inviting me to this session. I lead an organization that, if you look at the title, it's the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. And the first thing I'm always asked is, what is resilient infrastructure? I mean, and this is by all levels of individuals, experts. And how do you answer that question when you're sort of, you have 30 seconds, so I have a 30-second pitch, and what is resilient infrastructure? And my answer always is, when you look at building infrastructure, a lot of us understand safety, If you're an engineer, you understand safety, you understand certain attributes of infrastructure that you're designing for. But are you considering how risk from climate change, risk from natural hazards, are you actually considering that in your infrastructure investment, not just now, but over the long term? And often the answer is, yeah, we are, but maybe we are not, right? So there's not clarity clearly as to what is resilient infrastructure. So for us, what we are trying to do, we're sitting out of New Delhi. We are an international organization. The Indian government established this coalition, but we are now 37 countries who have joined the coalition and 7 organizations that have joined the coalition. And we're a charter-based organization, so it's let's promote the agenda of coalition of disaster resilient infrastructure. So we come out with reports. I have one in my hand, which really says when you're talking about resilient infrastructure, you're thinking about 2 things. One, your infrastructure itself is resilient over the long term. So, if there's a cyclone, if there's an earthquake, can your infrastructure perform at the time of the event and recover if it is damaged post, right? So the infrastructure itself. The second is how do you put infrastructure in place for resilience? So, how do you secure flood risk through infrastructure? How do you do that? So we're trying to parse out what is infrastructure. And there's lots of gaps in this space. I'll get into it more in detail, but starting from the whole evidence of risk on one end, do we actually know what is risk, physical risk? We have come out and we'll be launching a platform in the next 3 days where at the country level, one can start to see what is the physical risk from 6 kinds of hazards for 8 infrastructure types that can then start to inform, if you have an understanding of risk, what do you do about it? With UNDRR, we have come up with a principles document that says one needs to understand resilience from a systemic point of view. If your power system fails, the telecom cannot work. Telecom fails, hospitals don't have. So this whole systemic risk, how do you understand it? We have come up with a framework, at least from a governance point of view, to understand, is your policy framework even looking at risk from a much more comprehensive perspective? So our mandate is disaster resilient infrastructure. We're starting to look at that from an evidence point of view, data point of view, starting to think about capacity building, starting to think about technical assistance on the ground. How do you get people to actually buy into this idea of resilience? I'll stop there, and then we can get more into a discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And yes, we'll get into, and for those who are in the room, because those online won't be able to ask questions, we will have a Q&A session and try to make this lively. So now to you, Louis Downing. You're Australian, so I shouldn't say Louis, but I don't know. But so can you give us a little bit of more detail? And we're mentioning examples on how this label is being built, and what are you up to at Global Infrastructure Basel, together with Bloomberg, really developing this label for fast infra?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Thierry. Thanks for everyone for joining as well, and thanks for the people who are joining online and chose not to fly to COP this year as well, reducing your emissions a little bit. Maybe just to take a quick step back. We're all here for the same reason. We're here to improve the prospects of the planet with regard to climate change. We've already experienced between 1.1 to 1.3 degrees climate change increase, and our target is 1.5. So things are not looking very good. The current prospect is that we would hit 1.5 in the next 6 years.
Okay, no climate gloom, huh?
Sorry? No climate gloom. But okay, so let's turn that into an active call to action. I think it's very appropriate that we have this panel together with the CDRI and the EBRD Because as that 1.5 target becomes more and more unlikely for us to reach, it becomes increasingly important that we focus on adaptation and our ability to bounce back. And I'll also say it doesn't reduce the importance of mitigation. On the contrary, it makes it far, far more important that we focus on mitigation. So, quick step back. Thanks for indulging that, Thierry. But to talk about the label, 79% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from infrastructure, so it's critically important that we build the right infrastructure right now. We're missing, X trillion, say 3 trillion, depending on which report you read, to be able to do that. So the purpose of the label is to motivate private finance into that sector. And the way that the label is doing that, if I summarize it in three C's, one is providing credibility. One is providing consistency, and one is providing cost effectiveness. So if I break those down a little bit, credibility is exactly what Amit was talking about. What is resilient infrastructure, and for us also sustainable and regenerative infrastructure. So providing a consistent standard for what that is, both at the asset level and at the fund level as well. Consistency then is about seeing that we can all speak a common language about that, and that speaks also to investors and helps us to build the data foundation that we need to lift sustainable infrastructure out as an independent asset class and pave the way for more institutional investors to get involved as well. And then in terms of cost effectiveness, we're really talking about setting the label up in such a way that we can reduce the cost of project sourcing, reduce the cost and time it takes for due diligence and risk assessment, and enable sustainable infrastructure to be more investable more efficiently. So that's what we're aiming at. How the standard is set up is there are 14 criteria spanning 4 different dimensions, so an E, SG, and an R. So environment, society, governance. And the R is separated out as resilience because that's a really key element from our perspective. A project applying to get the label needs to first meet a set of baseline requirements, minimum safeguards, which are based mostly upon the IFC performance standards with some gaps filled. And then they need to demonstrate positive contribution to one of a set of positive sustainability goals, so like climate mitigation, climate adaptation, biodiversity, gender. There's a range of them. They're like the different flavors of the standard, if you like. In terms of how it's been developed and what we're doing as a secretariat, so as Thierry mentioned, it was sparked in President Macron's One Planet Lab. And since then, it's had more than 100 institutions across the entire infrastructure value chain, some of the most important institutions, standing behind it and contributing to its development. And many of those now have formed into the governance groups of the label. So there are 2 governance bodies that make all the decisions on the label. And last year, Bloomberg and GIB were appointed as the secretariat and the data repository, respectively. And so we're managing those governance bodies. We're doing what we're told by the steering committee, who makes all of the decisions, basically. And we're really delighted to announce that we have the first 5 labelled projects now. And into next year, we'll be... Right. Exactly, yeah. So, and we've had excellent feedback from the projects. Many of the project developers who've used the label have started piling up new projects for us to also assess because they're happy with the process. So that's the proof is in the pudding, as it's said. And so some of those projects as well are, from our perspective, are demonstrating some really amazing, replicable, sustainable, resilient, regenerative characteristics. So, for example, in Philippines, we've assessed a project which has got a really great approach to combating food security issues at the same time as energy security issues. So looking at photovoltaics combined with agriculture. In Mumbai, another fantastic example of where electric transport is being powered by renewable energies with solar panels installed at the new infrastructure to enable that bus network, so at the stations and so forth. So a lot of great examples. Happy to get into it in more detail. Thanks, Thierry.
Well, now we will have the opportunity, but I think it's always good to put real meat on the bone when we talk about these labels. They're not theoretical. They actually mean something on the ground. So in the same vein of thoughts, we have Lyda Fitz here from US Treasury, your Director for Sustainability. And the US has also developed an approach around the Blue Dot network. And perhaps you can talk a little bit about this and where you see similarities and interoperability of those various approaches and labels. I think you're on.
Am I on?
Closer, maybe?
This is good? Yeah. There we go. Sorry about that. Better with infrastructure than technology, I guess. So I'm Lyda Fitz from the US Treasury. I have been working in infrastructure over the last 15 or 20 years and have seen an unfortunate number of infrastructure projects fail after they are constructed. And that is nothing more painful than buying something as expensive as infrastructure, thinking it's going to last several decades and being a couple of years in and having it go wrong. That's a very expensive and unfortunate experience for any country. And now that our government budgets are tighter and we're focused on where we can spend those monies towards climate action, all the more upsetting. I think for that reason, the G20 really focused on quality, and I am the representative of the U.S. into the infrastructure working group in the G20. It's been many years looking at how we could develop common principles to save countries from that experience. And so the quality principles for quality infrastructure investment discussed over many years and finally adopted in 2022 is the basis for, I think, is first of all a common set of standards that projects can refer to, but they are principles versus what you can actually the bars against which a project can measure. So I appreciate that both Fast Infra and Blue Dot Network, which the U.S. Is helping to lead with partners in Australia and Japan, starting in 2019, both work to address that. How can you take these broad principles and make them measurable? Blue Dot Network, or BDN for short, is designed to be easy to use tool to demonstrate that a project fulfills those QII principles that the G20 endorsed and is able to measure them. And it operates as a certification. It was actually inspired by LEED certification for buildings, so that it's an easily recognized standard to understand, what level of green major building infrastructure is. Could we adopt this across a whole range of infrastructure so that you could see that genuine benefits, that it would also help to drive more private sector investment into infrastructure, the idea that you're able with proper planning to de-risk and avoid delays that often increase the cost. So as I noted, in 2019, we launched BDN with partners in Australia and Japan. The UK, Spain, and Switzerland have joined the steering committee this year. And the OECD has provided technical support, including by developing a process to assess projects, defining the criteria, and having detailed requirements for certification. So while BDN is centered on QIA principles, it also utilizes other standards, equator principles, IFC performance standards, looked out, what's the broad, how can we make best use of what's already in use and not known in the marketplace. So OECD consolidated 80 different standards, mapped them against QIA principles, and then streamlined them to have one comprehensive set of metrics. Climate's, of course, a big element. Both BDN and Fast Infra play a critical role in mobilizing capital, or hope will play a critical in mobilizing capital towards climate-oriented projects. BDN sort of projects need to be aligned with countries' NDCs and with a net zero pathway for 2050 or sooner. And BDN and Fast Infra are highly complementary, as Thierry noted. They both aim to raise standards in infrastructure, create higher quality, attract more private sector investment, and they both don't create new standards. We want to avoid lengthening the already long cycle of infrastructure development. We share a lot of the same standards, BDN and Fast Infra, on environmental and social elements, and Fast Infra and BDN also both very much look at IFC performance standards. BDN also looks at consideration of the life cycle costs, transparency, and debt sustainability. And will require an independent third-party assessment and a certification that the project has met the requirements. We've worked closely with the OECD to develop BDN framework, and this year, OECD has begun testing that on 8 projects globally that we're piloting out. It tested whether the assessment system is user-friendly and also not too burdensome that you're adding costs, and that are we being able to demonstrate quality as a result. And I'd say that while pilot projects are ongoing, early results are promising. Project developers have said that they're ambitious but achievable, and that one of our projects in Palau, a subsea cable project, was able to complete the BDN assessment and met or exceeded all the requirements. So demonstrating that even small countries can achieve going through the standard. We've also done pretty extensive outreach to the private sector. I know that's another thing that we share. And in fact, we just held a consultation with CEOs during Climate Week in New York around infrastructure and asked them for recommendations, very non-directive, and we just got them last night, and one of them was, please, can you expand Blue Dot Network or standards that can help de-risk infrastructure projects for us? We are looking at BDN as playing a role that it's got to, along standards that it's got to be easy to access, it's got to create a level playing field that limits low-quality firms and projects from entering the market. It provides a form of TA for developing countries to better structure projects to attract private sector investment. And it, we hope, will lead to lower financing costs so that the time spent in meeting those standards has an immediate payoff. So I'm happy to say that Fast Infra and BDN have formed a working group that meets on a regular basis to make sure that we, as we grow and evolve, we remain complementary. And we've tentatively identified a joint pilot project to really put into practice how the two can work together. Our end goal is a recognition system between the two initiatives so that if you've completed as a project certification for one, that work would be recognized by the other, so you wouldn't have to redo it. And we're also in BDN looking at how we can recognize projects that have met the requirements of the MDBs. We would certainly want to avoid a duplication. That we don't have FAST in our name, that's certainly a goal that we share. And we are looking forward to making sure that we are working with major infrastructure initiatives like PGI, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, and the EU's Global Gateway, so that as we push out investment, we're making sure that we are not going back to a range of 80 standards, but can as much as possible use the same.
Thank you, Lida. That's very comprehensive in terms of comparison. So now we'll move to a user and you're supposed to provide a very critical view of how useful this is for you. Nandita from EBRD, in particular in charge of the Green City program, but not only. Could you share with us sort of the benefits that you expect from such label and in terms of contributing to the overall sustainable infrastructure challenge?
Thank you, Thierry. And as you already reminded us, there is a huge need, especially in developing economies, for investment in infrastructure and clean energy, not only to meet the global climate agenda, but to drive sustainable, resilient economic development in these countries. And we also know there is no... He's asking me to... Oh, sorry, my hair is blocking. Is this better? Okay. And as we also know, there is not enough capacity or financing from just the public sector and multilateral development banks, no matter how much we scale up. So to finance all of these needs, we have to mobilize the private sector. But we also know there's no shortage of investors and financiers looking for sustainable investments. But the bulk of these investments is still going to the developed world, even though the need is greatest in the developing world. So our challenge is really to find a way to channel all that capital and funds, and another 30 billion was pledged at this COP, looking for a sustainable home, into much needed infrastructure projects in emerging markets and developing economies. And this is why we at EBRD, but also other multilateral development banks, are increasingly focusing on creating the enabling environment and developing bankable projects with the standards that would attract private investment into sustainable infrastructure. So at EBRD, around 6-7 years ago, we consciously started working upstream to generate that pipeline of bankable projects for the private sector. So engaging with our countries on policy reforms, improvements in regulation, helping develop the legal and contractual frameworks to structure and tender infrastructure PPPs, including renewable energy auctions and other such private-public partnership opportunities. So to give you a flavor of, sort of what we've done to date since we started this, we have signed on approximately 5 billion euros, 5 gigawatts worth of renewable auction mandates in about 15 countries, and about 4 billion euros worth of infrastructure PPP mandates. And these include projects, concessions like Sofia Airport, Thierry, that you know well, where we were involved in preparing the project. We brought the private investor, Meridiam, into the project, and then we took it all the way to financial close with a lot of standards, particularly bringing in greening opportunities into a vital piece of not always obvious green infrastructure airports. But these are just a drop in the ocean. And we really need to find a way to do much more and far more efficiently to scale up this pipeline of bankable projects and ensure we attract that investment looking for sustainable destinations. And this is where the FAST label comes in. A recognized label like FAST with the 3 C's that Louis explained so well will give such projects a robust stamp of approval. That's key for sustainable investors and particularly institutional investors, and hopefully improve the speed of decision making and help bring these projects to market more efficiently. So our real hope is that this will allow us, using this label, to attract a much broader level of investors in emerging markets. So we also welcome very much the collaborative approach that FAST is taking with other initiatives like the Blue Dot Network that Lida talked about, because it's absolutely key to be efficient, avoid duplication of efforts, and take friction out of the system. So just to tell you a little bit about what we have done with FAST so far. So we did a very early testing of the label on a dry port PPP in Egypt and also the Jordan Schools PPP. And in both cases, the results were really quite promising. And we hope that once those projects get underway, we will actually be able to certify them under FAST. But let me leave you with a glimpse of a couple of things we've got down the pipeline of projects where we're at the very early stage of developing and where we really think it's important to use FAST from the outset and really take the label beyond the pilot phase. And the first one is a green desalination PPP project in Egypt, where we're mandated to prepare this by the Suez Canal Special Economic Zone. And it's on an expedited schedule, as this is a very vital piece of infrastructure for the expected green hydrogen boom in Egypt. So we really hope this will be a great first opportunity to fully apply the FAST Sustainable Infrastructure label and receive cross-certification, hopefully, with the Blue Dot Network. And the second one, and Thierry asked me to concrete, so I'm leaving you with some concrete projects, is in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, where we intend to promote FAST and the Blue Dot Network across the country's ambitious program for social infrastructure, with the first schools and dormitory PPPs now under preparation, and with a real emphasis on green, resilient building standards for life cycle costing and long-term asset management, such as facilities management PPPs, which we believe is quite ideally suited for a label like FAST and consistent with the standards that we know are being promoted by the G20 across the MDB system. So really, just to conclude, we really think this is the opportunity to go from the pilot testing we've been doing so far to actually rolling this label out and to really testing and measuring the efficiency that it brings to the process and, most importantly, the private investment. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Nandita. We love the sound of this. Practitioners doing things on the ground. It's music to my ears. So last but not least in this first round, Christian, you were MD at HSBC Group, one of the historic sponsor of this initiative. So why did you do it?
Why did we do it? Because it was the right thing to do, and because, frankly, it had been extremely frustrating to see the lack of mobilization of institutional capital for such an important asset class. Look, I'm not going to spend too much time on the origins because I think everything has been covered. Just want to say a couple of things. One, recognize the humility with which we've been doing it, meaning, look, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We wanted to look for practical solutions that could unlock capital, look at what works. Green bond principles was a really important inspiration for us, putting together various stakeholders and coming up with something which has worked in the green bond market and we think can work also on the sustainable infra side. And the second thing is really the collaborative nature. You need to bring all the stakeholders together, civil society, NGOs, public sector, private sector, and I want to recognize two institutions that have been absolutely critical in bringing the label to life. It's Global Infrastructure Basel, and Mariana is here, and it's Macquarie. The two of them have been... I'm sorry? No, I'm sorry, what did I say? Global Infrastructure Facility, I'm sorry. I'm totally, I've been running around, as you can see, I'm sweating, and but yeah, GIF, Mariana, Astrid, Tofika, everybody has been critical, and also Macquarie has been leading the work in a really efficient way. The second thing I would like to say is, look, we plan to use it, and we're using it. So we kind of want to lead by examples, and I'll give you 3 examples. One is asset management. So we are also an asset manager. We're launching a sustainable infrastructure debt. We're following the guidelines of the Fast Infra label. We're also going to be doing a sustainable infra equity fund, which is also planning to follow the guidelines of the label. So using it in our asset management products. That's important because that's a link to institutional investors, and that's really the market that we want to tap. Second thing, in putting it into our lending practices, so including that in the way we finance sustainable infrastructure, we think it can be extremely useful, and I'm not going to repeat that, but help with reporting, monitoring, being aligned with various taxonomies and so on and so forth. So the banks and when we lend, we don't necessarily lend to keep it on our books forever. We want to distribute to the market. We want to sell. We want to securitize. We want to repackage. We want to distribute the risk. So we know that if the loans include a fast infra label, it will be easier to distribute. It will play this catalytic role, which is so important. So including it in our guidelines. And the third thing which I'm going to mention is we set up a joint venture with Temasek, which is called Pentagreen. Pentagreen is using the fast infra label, and in fact, Pentagreen is one of the first projects to be labeled. It's important because first of all, it's a joint venture with an important sovereign wealth fund. It was set up, it was established to also unlock a bottleneck, unlock a gap, and that gap is lack of financing for marginally bankable projects. So if we embed fast infra into that structure, by the way, receives technical assistance from the Asian Development Bank and is also linked to Clifford Capital. Clifford Capital is one of the very successful example of financing vehicle for infrastructure that has access to capital markets, that has been securitizing and selling portfolios to institutional investors. So that connectivity also with Clifford Capital and with the institutional market is quite important. So Pentagreen is an example of how we can use existing synergies, help unlock capital by solving some of the bottlenecks or addressing some of the bottlenecks. And the last way we're planning to use it is by promoting the label. This label is going to be successful and catalytic, that is, will attract investment and will allow for a lower cost of capital for infrastructure projects, and therefore we encourage sponsors and government to embed higher sustainability standards in the projects, which is the ultimate goal of this initiative. It will be successful if it becomes an industry standard. So we are in GFANS, we are in SMI, we are in the JETP, we are now, and thank you, Veronica, for making it happen. We're now part of ETAF, the IRENA platform for sustainable infrastructure. So we want to promote the use of the label in all those fora where we are, and that's the way it is going to be. Successful.
So, which leads me to the key trillion-dollar question to both of you, Louis and Christian. So, if you were to have a goal in a year, because we're all early adopters here, and we're already convinced before we started. So, what would be your market penetration in terms of adoption, and how many trillions do you think you can move?
18 months from now. So currently we've labeled 5 projects, and the rollout for us looks and those are all renewable energy projects. So we've only focused on that sector so far. So early next year, then we'll be opening up to many more sectors, and then also opening the doors to promoting the label more and trying to get as many projects on as possible. So we're hoping for between 50 to 100 projects next year, and then many hundreds in the following years, basically.
The road to 2030 is very short. So
that's right.
We got to get going. So Christian, same sort of question, but how strong are your beliefs in terms of this sort of cracking the capital market in terms of taking them to this asset class? Do you see this becoming an asset class soon?
Soon depends on your definition of soon. I think the interoperability with the Blue Dot network is very important, because I think it's a good thing that there are several labels, but they shouldn't be, they should be competing, but they shouldn't be too far apart. So the fact that on ESG and climate resiliency there is really strong overlap is, I think, a really good thing. Look, we're part of all those initiatives. I mentioned JETP and so on and so forth. PSIL is an important one, the Private Sector Investment Lab, led by Mark Carney and Shriti Vadera, which is really creating, I think, some kind of a new playground between the public sector and the private sector. So I think this will create some opportunity for products that can be scaled. Very encouraged also by the focus on project development, project preparation that I see from ETAF, ACP that was launched yesterday, GIF, which is also ramping up, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of focus on one of the critical elements of the, if we want to solve the equation, which is the fact that only 5 to 10% of projects are bankable, and we need to work on the rest. So I'm encouraged by that. I would say that we need, if we want to scale, we need technology to start being integrated into that. In the US, I've got a very strong French accent, but I've been living in the US for the last 25 years. The US has been successful at creating really, really deep markets for mortgages, for MBS, for treasuries, and so on and so forth. Technology is at the center of it. So we need to somehow bring technology into the development of projects, the financing of projects, the securitization of projects, so it can become some kind of like a cookie cutter. So I don't want to say standardization, but at least some products, some contracts that can be used at scale. And I want to highlight François Barthélémy here, which is in charge of the Tech Infra platform, because that's also one of the solutions. So Thierry mentioned at the beginning, Fast Infra Group is looking at various solutions, not reinventing the wheel, but stuff that can help move the needle. The label is one, I think the platform is another one, and if we continue creating like this products that can unlock, will be successful. But I mean, I've been in this market for too long to say that it's going to happen tomorrow.
I'm going to bring that question because I was thinking about asking Lida, because the U.S. capital markets is one of the deepest in the world. So when you go back home, what are going to be your conversations with regulators, with the market players to make this a market that understands sustainable infrastructure and make it a real asset class? Because if we started with this, we could go a long way.
I appreciate that you always have easy questions, right? I do think scale is critically important. It's difficult when you're dealing with long-dated assets and long prep times, and when part of our core goal here is quality. And so I think that you always do need to balance that, balance the need for speed, which is very real, with the need for quality. I think that when I look at scales of markets, it reminds me of actually, this is really an EBRD idea, and focus on expanding the ability of governments themselves, emerging markets, to prioritize and prepare and recognize projects, to be able to use these standards, but also to be able to conduct that analysis, to understand, best use of funds, highest ROI from a social perspective as well. We heard yesterday on stage one of our institutional investor partners say, he bucketed challenges to infrastructure in data, and I think that that's one thing we really hope to see from Fast Infra and BDN, is not only the help in moving things, but then being able to share out the progress of those projects, that will help to draw more investors in and reach the scale that you mentioned. And they said project prep. And so I do think that this is obviously a tool that can be used to prepare projects by governments, and is very much been supported. I come from a background of project prep, and we work very closely with GIF and hope to be able as the U.S. to more formally support it. And then he mentioned FX, which is, I know, it's something that Terry thinks about, thorny challenge, as well as overall de-risking. And I definitely think that these standards, while not the sort of concessionary tools that are often called for, discussed in de-risking, are very much de-risking tools that can be used to to further scale in markets that can then demonstrate the number of projects that they have that are able to meet these standards. So I'd say those four can help us get there, but I'm not going to make a prediction on time.
No, I can understand. So, actually, talking about sort of de-risking, and there is an MDB reform, or World Bank in particular, ongoing. I won't give you that one, Lida. You already had your difficult one. I was gonna talk to Nandita because you're a practitioner. You adopted. So, what do you think this label, those two labels, what can they play in this whole MDB reform program that is going on?
Well, look, I mean, one of the key elements of the MDB reform agenda is really how do we scale up, right? How do we use MDBs more efficiently to mobilize more private capital? I mean, that's one of the main agenda items. The private sector lab that Ajay has set up, is supposed to be really coming up with ideas on how best to leverage. But I just go back to what I talked about earlier, which is, there are some very fundamental things that MDBs can do, which is engaging directly with governments, with countries, and just getting the investment environment right. And that's an advantage we have that institutional investors and private investors don't. And if we can get the overall investment framework right, we can get the overall regulatory environment right, that's the best de-risking you can do. Is having a reliable environment in which to invest, because we can come up with ideas for de-risking the FX on this project and that project, but that's just one-off. If you want to really have scalable de-risking, you have to de-risk the whole environment in a country. So I really think the key for MDBs is going to be engaging directly with governments at the level where you create really a whole bankable country system and not focus only on individual projects. But then, of course, the next step is preparing projects. That's what we're already doing. And we just have to do a lot more of it. And when you talk about the labels and the two labels and where do they fit in, I think, and I said this to Louis earlier, is really the proof will be in the pudding, right? When we actually start to apply these labels to these projects, are we going to see the private investor come? Are they really going to bring us what we're looking for, which is a diversification of private investors, and the kind of projects that we're working on with these country platforms, such as the desal I talked about in Egypt. When we bring that to market, using these labels, will we see the usual suspects, or will we see HSBC actually coming to the table and investing in these projects? So I think that the MDBs need to work on growing the pie, and these labels really have to bring the pie to the investors.
I have a totally biased proposition, which you said you're an early adopter. So what if we said all the MDBs of the world have to use one of those two labels in anything they do, so they actually disseminate the use of the label and actually create that standard on a systematic basis, not just on a case-by-case basis. I'm sure IFC will love that.
Well, I mean, I will say this, that maybe I'm just cautious here, but I do think success breeds success. So I think we really need to first see the early wins. And we need to see those early wins in concrete terms of, as I said, for me, the key is the diversification of private investors. Not you, Thierry, each time on our emerging market projects on your own, but really seeing Veronica there and Christian there. And for me, that will be a measure of success. And I think if we see that once, twice, the dissemination will happen. Everybody will want it.
Perfect. So, Amit, you're coming from an angle of more policy and from the government sort of lens. So when you hear all that, what do you believe?
So I also actually I've spent a lot of my career in project preparation in the US, but also Vietnam, Singapore, China, etc. And I've just, two things. One, in this whole discussion, we are not recognizing that governments, national governments, are spending a lot of money on infrastructure. The national infrastructure pipeline in India at this point is in trillions of dollars. So how does such a label, and this is a question that I'm getting asked, how does the national infrastructure pipeline in India start looking at resilience and sustainability? So how do we use labels such as this, even for the national investments that are planned, state level investments that are planned? How does one bring such kind of metrics of, at least at a very, very, very upstream level, starting to understand, are we actually even recognizing the various attributes of resilience and sustainability in the investment? That's one side of it. Louis talked about a couple of projects, and if you think about where they're located, Bombay and Philippines, I'm guessing Manila, these are the urban centers where there's capacity. But when you see where investment is going across the developing countries, emerging markets, a lot of it is not necessarily in your urban centers. It's actually where they may or may not be capacity. So that is getting to my second point. I'm very familiar with Leeds. And if you think about Leeds and how it actually evolved, and then it led to something called EDGE, right? Now, Leeds became very cumbersome at one point because it became very difficult for somebody in parts of the world where maybe capacity was limited to take that and apply it in certain contexts. And then the IFC came up with EDGE, and suddenly EDGE has taken off, right? So I love the fact fast infra. I think we have to always be conscious as we're developing these standards is to the context of where they can get applied and who has the capacity to take it and scale it up. And if you're looking for scale, if places like India take this up, scale is not a problem. This thing can spread like a. Now you see what's happening with EDGE, and the amount of, EDGE has got I forget, the millions of square foot of buildings are now certified as EDGE. And that has been over a span of 5 years or 4 years. So I think the opportunity is to also, when we're developing these standards, to think, and I'm keen to work with you on this. That's where, CDRI wants to sit on the table and start to understand is how does one take this standard and how applicable is it in contexts where capacity may or may not be there, and speed. You see how quickly, like I remember in China, I used to joke, I was working in the US for AECOM, which is a consulting company, right, designing infrastructure. And I remember a colleague of mine from the US going to China, and he would write back and say, the guys, those concept scribbles that you did, well, those have gone into construction drawings and construction has already started. And so that's what you're seeing in a lot of the world is that the pace of infrastructure construction is so fast. So how do we make sure that these labels don't interrupt that pace, but can accept that pace as well? So those are my reflections.
No, I think the importance of a market-based solution is also for that. So it's adaptable, and also the reference to the G20 quality infrastructure principle is important because that involves the entire G20, so different type of geographies, different type of issues. We're not exporting the EU taxonomy, just to make that clear. I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying we're not exporting it through the label. It has to be user-friendly, it has to be quick because the market needs something quick as well. So it's quite important, the comment you just made. So Louis, are you online with this? Or are we going to have to correct the course?
No, 100%. And I think that's exactly the reason as well that we chose projects in the locations that we chose. So Vietnam, Philippines, and India, because there are huge pipelines of infrastructure there. As you said, we're not exporting the EU taxonomy, but we are aware of the scope of applicability of the SFDR globally, and the fact that very similar initiatives or reporting requirements are underway in other geographies. And for a lot of the asset managers and financiers with whom we've spoken, this is actually becoming a very big barrier to them investing in sustainable infrastructure. So it's having, in some cases, the opposite impact of what those disclosure regulations are seeking to improve. And I think that's an important element of the standard that we haven't spoken about, sorry, of the label that we haven't spoken about, is the ability to generate a report from the data that's inputted, which will then gather that asset level information and enable a portfolio level disclosure to be made. So that's something that's in our pipeline to build out that functionality next year, which we're very excited about.
Meantime, go ahead. Now you can jump in, and I'm inviting the public also to prepare their questions, because right after this you'll be able to also put your questions.
We've been able to aggregate risk to infrastructure at the national level and literally launching this in 3 days. So I'll be very happy to see how, and it's going to be in the public domain, so see how you can use this information, the risk information on infrastructure, assets and linear infrastructure, point infrastructure, etc., and the kinds of risk that's facing. So let's have a conversation.
Definitely, yeah.
When you mentioned this reporting function and the ability to report to various normative framework, I mean, that's really one of the key benefits of using the label when you speak to institutional investors. You say, like, you're making my life so much easier.
Yeah. I think the data and transfer of data and transparency of data will be one of the key things to really create a market. I think we all understand the need for that. Any question? Yes. I think a microphone needs to be handed to you, because otherwise I think Christian is the one who stole the microphone.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. I'm Maria Fernanda from the National Infrastructure Development Bank in Colombia, FDN. So I think we've spoken. Thank you so much for everyone. We were part of conversations while developing the Fast Infra label. And my question is, how can development banks like us and with partners like GIF, that we participate in the pre-investment phase of all of these projects, how can we really be an ally for you to disseminate the label and use it from these really previous project phases, so we can then have that label and be ready to be financed in the following cycle of the project?
Louis, to say a word after.
Comment, yeah. Fantastic and great to meet you, because we have been in contact many times. One of the ideas that came actually from Clemente del Valle, who's got some, historic association with the label FDN, obviously, was that at some point when we grow, it's still early stage group, but when we grow, we have like local, regional offices for promotion, for adoption. In some cases, maybe for adaptation. I mean, what you were saying in terms of making sure they continue to be relevant and can be deployed rapidly. I mean, Edge, for instance, has been super successful in Colombia because they've teamed up with the right players to make it a local standard. So I think, and I'm speaking under your control, but I think it would be great if Fast Infra Group could have local offices in various regions, and would very much welcome a collaboration.
You want to add something, Louis? Or?
So these are exactly the conversations that we want to be having right now as we expand to new sectors. There's a few ways that you could get involved as a national development bank. So one way would be to choose some projects that are already in your portfolio and test the label out on those, and then really get a sense of feeling for how it works and then how it can be integrated upstream. You can also get involved in the ongoing development of the label by joining the Executive Advisory Council, and there's a range of working groups sitting under that as well. I mean, we're also the label applies at the asset level, but there's also a fund and portfolio level claim, a set of claims that can be made against the label. So something we're also working with, partners like Christian on is what claim, in what ways can we set up a fund, for example, that has a claim against the Fast Infra label to say, X% of the projects are compliant with a certain positive contribution, and so forth. And in terms of regional representation, so we're about to open an office in Singapore, but certainly in the Americas, we're interested to have a physical presence there. And one of the exciting, we have a whole product rollout planned, and some of the exciting features that we have coming up are so training for verification bodies who will be local organizations, but also training for professionals. So putting some of the bank's employees through that training could also be a great way to get involved. And as we label more projects, then there'll be a whole database of labeled projects that you'll have access to and be able to see, these fit with our priorities and these ones that we could get involved in.
Thank you. There's a question over there.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Akeo. I work as an affordable housing consultant, both in New York with the New York Energy Research and Development Authority. In the Clean and Resilient Buildings unit, I also work with African affordable housing developers. My question really is around this label. I mean, it's very exciting, this Fast Infra label, following a lot how the label has been announced and launched into the market. So our sector is definitely looking forward to it. But I'm pretty much wondering how, I guess, the label sort of reconciles the fact that it's very broad. I mean, infrastructure is a very broad asset class, whereas, you've referenced the lead, you've referenced edge. These are very sector-specific labels, because also, I mean, these sectors also have a very deep value chain. So how does Fast Infra, how do you foresee sort of, overcoming that, the fact that the label is so broad, and, when you're looking at the market awareness and sort of educating the market about how to use this label, how will you be tackling that?
It will have a sector approach, and I'll let Louis, because at the end of the day, when you think about IFC standards being a basis for it, IFC standard covers quite a number of sectors, and they go deep into every single sector. So I think, Louis, you were hinting earlier that although you started with renewable energy or solar, I can't remember, you're moving towards next year. So you want to say a little bit about your sectorial approach?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, if you look at an example like a wind farm, how do you demonstrate that a wind farm is a part of the circular economy, and to what extent do you start looking at things like, where the blades were manufactured, or impacts on biodiversity, and light flicker from the blades and so forth. It's very sector specific. The underlying sustainability objectives tend to be sector agnostic. So what we're doing with the governance bodies of the label is creating, well, this is the existing structure, and we're not creating it, is a sector agnostic foundation for the label, and then where a deep dive is needed for different sectors, then building out indicators for them. And as it was said before, we're not creating new indicators. We're linking to existing standards or reporting frameworks to draw those indicators out, and then creating a cross-referencing back to those frameworks.
I can add, if you think about the Environmental Policy Act, right, the NEPA or SECRA in New York, I worked there for about 25 years ago, so I'm just remembering it may or may not be there, SECRA. It didn't matter what action you were taking or what investment you were making, but you actually had to do an evaluation from environmental and social purposes, right? So it was infrastructure, it was sector agnostic. It's a methodology. It's in a way of evaluation to say, this is what you're conceptualizing. Are you taking the box across, gender and, supply chains? So there's a whole way of evaluation that can actually be sector agnostic. And I suspect, I mean, I need to get more into it, but there are enough examples. I mean, IFC standards and all where it doesn't matter what sector you're in. I mean, but the framing of how you're actually looking at it and then starting to record it and report on it, and then the consistency comes through that. So, but I don't know enough about fast infra yet, so I don't want to take credit. Yeah.
You have one last question here.
Hi, my name is Raffaele Della Croce, and I used to work at OECD, so I've been behind some of these initiatives for a long time. So it's great to see this happening. Well done, amazing. That's what is needed, implementation, implementation, implementation. Even more so after I've been serving the Italian government, the Minister for Infrastructure, trying to implement the recovery plan, very much on these same topics, and seeing how it's difficult to get the actionable side of this EU taxonomy, sort of high-level principle on sustainability on which we all agree on, but then at the ground level it's much more difficult to get this done, especially getting together the financial community and the engineering community, which I see it is here represented, so that to me is great. I'll add another element, a comment. I'm now in academia. I'm working at the Imperial College, and I think academia should not be left behind this discussion. Because when we talk about broadening the investor set using then this type of standards, the ESG plus R, or the taking them into account the risk, the physical risk, then we need to progress with academia with the evidence base, which is not there yet. And we see this reflected in the narrative that here, for example, at the COP, for the first time, adaptation is being taken seriously, but not there yet for the impact that we're going to have over the next decades. So we do need this evidence. We need the systemic approach, which was mentioned, the cascading risks included into consideration. This is missing now in the climate modeling that financial institutions are subject to. So there is a role for financial regulators. I think there are positive signs. There is the experience of the insurance sector. There is the NGFS launching a new adaptation financing group. So clearly these initiatives should be linked to the mainstream climate narrative, because I think that's a lever which is important for then the investors and implementation side of this initiative.
Well, thank you. I have one last question. It's a gloomy one, but you need to give me a positive answer to each of you. I mean, we sort of very much practitioners and excited about filling up this gap, but we live in sort of a geopolitical atmosphere, economic and geopolitical, that is brings everything to reality at the end of the day. So, and Lida mentioned, for example, one of the features of BDN is on the debt sustainability. So, especially when we talk about emerging market, current economic situation, despite the fact that we're a G20 sort of framework, creates quite a lot of tension on fiscal space for a lot of governments, and sort of forces them almost to be in a standstill in terms of promoting investment. So how do you see this label, especially including that sort of sustainability, financial sustainability bit into it, could help sort of overcome what is hopefully a temporary sort of high US interest rate moment that is killing the emerging markets? You don't have to answer that first. So who wants to take that and give us a positive outcome on this?
I can deepen the gloom a little bit and then maybe pop out of it. So to deepen the gloom, I mean, when you mentioned the rising interest rates, there's a bunch of studies which have recently come out to point out that the higher interest rate punishes more sustainable infrastructure, more resilient infrastructure disproportionately to other infrastructure, because it tends to be more capex heavy, so the cost of capital is much higher. So that's very bad. Another thing that yeah, no. Can I deepen a little further?
Okay.
Another point that I don't hear so much in the discourse is we talk about mobilizing private capital to fill the infrastructure gap, and that means, in some way the projects need to be bankable, be it through clever blended finance mechanisms like Meridian sets up, or other ways. But in a worst case scenario, what we can do is set up infrastructure projects that no one really wants, that the people who need the most don't really need and can't afford, an infrastructure which is just servicing the richer strata of communities. And then in addition to that, we're servicing the private sector cost of capital in low middle income countries. So in a dystopian sort of scenario, we're setting up a rent from low and middle income countries to high income countries by closing this infrastructure gap. So that's the worst possible scenario. Now, out of the gloom, this is where standards come in, because, or labels like the Fast Infra label, because what you're doing by applying a label like the Fast Infra label is you're showing that the positive benefit of the project outweighs the cost of accessing that capital. You're looking at the social dimension, the environmental, the governance, and the resilience element to say this, like the cost, and there is a cost, is outweighed by the benefit that society environment is getting. So it's actually, we're winning. So that's the importance of the labels in this.
That was a good job. So you took one for the team. So it's time now to end this panel. But before we do so, I'll ask the panelists to stay seated. And Lyda is going to join me because we want to make a short, quick announcement. Because, as a conclusion of this panel, just to announce that the US and French government, actually the State Department and the Ministry of Finance of France, are making a joint statement on advancing sustainable resilient infrastructure, really emphasizing the importance of the collaboration between Fast Infra and BDN to really move things forward, and the aligned principle of the G20 quality infrastructure principles being the underlying basis for all this, and really an engagement to collaborate further to really move this forward, as they see it as an enabler to filling up this gap. So there'll be a statement issued by those two institutions right up. So thank you again. Merci à tous ceux qui nous écoutent, and thank you to all of those who are listening on live. And thank you, great panel, thank you. I know the questions weren't prepared and they were difficult, but it's much better this way. Thank you. Okay, you should bring your US flags with you when you travel. Okay. Quick panel picture.